Sasha, thanks for inviting me and thanks for everyone for coming today. I'll say just a little bit about the project. I won't say too much, but it puts a bit of context on it. So this was a project called Spaces of Translation in European Magazines from 1945 to 1965 that I did, and this is the last few months of the project. We've just had a project conference. It was done with Alison Martin, who works at JGU Mainz in Germany, so it was jointly funded by the UK and German research councils. And what we did in the project was to look at a small corpus of post-war magazines for 20 years that were British magazines, French magazines and German magazines. And here's a list of the British ones, about which mostly are taught today. And one of the things we wanted to do, what the kind of digital humanities bit of the project, is to produce a database which is there in a kind of, it's not yet publicly accessible, and I thought about showing it, but I think it's going to be a bit too complicated, but I can talk about it. But it's a database of everything that was translated in these magazines and who translated them. So the project's partly just trying to think about what the role of translation was in post-war European culture. You know, what got translated, who was translated, who was doing the work, and so on. And we picked those three areas because they were the language areas that we felt confident in the team to look at. But obviously what gets translated is a whole other set of languages. Here are the most of the French and German magazines. And I think one of the things we tried to do is to look at kind of not just the kind of iterations of the Modernism magazine, but also other kinds of magazines at this point, the Review, the Series Review. Neue Auslese was a kind of like a Reader's Digest type magazine as well, so again we got different kinds of things there. So as I said, I'm going to talk mainly about the British ones. I can talk with a little bit of knowledge about the French ones. The German ones I'm less competent about teaching because but I know a little bit about those if people want to pick those up. So one of the things that we've done is start with the people who are doing the digital humanities bit, just to look at things like, you know, what are the preponderance of languages. So this is just a chart of the database that shows us that we've got 64, though I think it's actually 65 languages that we found were translated there. The biggest percentage is English, because that's into the French and German ones. But then we started to look at, you know, drill down and do some of the things for the different language areas, and then the individual magazines. And I've got a couple of these data visualizations for a couple of the magazines that I've been to look at. So there's that bit of it, which is the database, and what you will be able to do is to look at the database and trace through what was translated, who did the work, how much Baudelaire was translated into German magazines, or how much Wittgenstein appeared in French magazines, and you know, do things like that to search through it fully and so on. And then the other side is probably what I'm going to talk about today, and other aspects, which is the more you know, questions that have arisen from doing the work about the various topics. And the topic I want to talk about then is really what happens with modernism as a concept in the post-war period in these British magazines. So I want to start with a map of Europe from 1945. Many maps of Europe would, of course, have been pored over by citizens in the previous 6 years. Maps displaying military advances, defeats, captured cities, or the changing borders of territories under occupation and liberation. However, the map that graced the internal cover papers of the 1945 copy of this magazine, New Road, Directions in European Art and Letters, an annual, proudly portrayed a different cartographic vision, designed by someone called Frederick Cook. This was a map of Europe lacking lines demarcating national boundaries. The Americas exist to the left in darkness, with blotches of darker material, like threatening clouds, covering most of Britain and Europe from west to east. The continent of Africa is only signified by a line at the bottom of the page, while Asia is almost completely off the page. So there is a kind of obsession with Europe that's there. The key geographical markers are ones indicating from where the writers and artists in the volume originate, with arrows locating them in 12 countries on the map. But curiously, the American writers Henry Miller and Kenneth Patchen are not linked east to the US, and that may just be about the visual design of the map. What then might this map signify to us about the new road of mid-century modernism in Britain? One key feature I'm going to talk about today in understanding the fate of modernism in post-war Britain is the significance of translation. In this issue of New Road, there are 33 translated works alone, which is over half the total number of items. So here's just one of New Road. Over the course of the 5 issues of the magazine, the translations from 11 languages, 115 translated works by 36 different translators, which equates to an average of about 23 translated works per issue, which is much the highest in any of the British magazines we looked at, and is probably, I think, the highest in any of the corpus overall. The most common languages, as you can see there, are French, 39%, German, 19%, Portuguese, 13, 10%, and then similar proportions for other languages: Urdu, Russian, Slovenian, Serbo-Croat, Italian, and Polish. So the question to pose to this when we started looking at this magazine was, why so much translation? And I think one reason is the exilic nature of the editor, and that's a feature that a number of the other magazines share. The editor of this issue was somebody called Fred Marnow, and I should say that Fred Marnow is not the same as Fred Murnau, who was the expressionist German film director of Nosferatu, so this is a different character. I was quite excited when I think of him, I know he's a different guy. But Marnow himself was very interesting. He was born in 1918 in Pressburg, a city in Central Europe known since 1919, of course, as Bratislava, and where Slovakian, Hungarian and German identities mingled. Marnow, whose mother tongue was German, arrived as a refugee in London in 1939. Already a published poet, after a period of internment as an enemy alien, he began working for a journal called Poetry Quarterly. Now, Marnow's cosmopolitan European heritage can be heard clearly in his editorial for this issue. He says, New Road was intended to be a literary annual of essentially European character, but not exclusively so. It hoped to demonstrate a belief in the spirit of Europe, he writes, and to be an instrument for the regaining and continuation of trends of an older tradition of creative culture and liberty, a tradition which in the last 30 years has twice been interrupted. So writing in May 1945, just a few months before the conclusion of the war, Marnow was well aware that the spirit of Europe was essentially broken. He writes there, Europe and contemporary European man constitute a pest house and humiliated bodies and lost souls. So if we go think back to the map, though the map had no hard borders, it does not represent a simplistic transnational European identity that is shared.
No, I'm very sorry.
When did you start it?
Yes.
You kind of sit there. So the map doesn't represent a kind of simple, we just all get Europeans together and put them all behind us. Because I think that large dark shadow across the continent, see the cover there, is a kind of pictorial equivalent to Marnell's Pest House of Lost Souls. It represents the spirit of Europe urgently requiring repair. So translation and the transnational sharing of culture was the central to this vision of a revival of European culture. Also central for many was the role of magazines. A year after New Road's mapping of post-war Europe, T.S. Eliot gave 3 lectures for the BBC German radio service on the unity of European culture. Published, first of all, in Berlin, in German, in 1946, they appeared first in English in this magazine, a bilingual magazine, English and French, called Adam International Review. And I've said a bit more about Adam later on. But in these articles, Eliot argued for the commonality of European culture, focusing on such features as a shared Christian heritage, something Eliot was interested in. But in his second talk, Eliot considered the idea that European unity might be enhanced by the development of periodical culture across national boundaries. So he looked back to the pre-war periodical that he had edited, which you know was the Criterion, started in 1922. The Wasteland was published in it. And he claimed that in that magazine, he had the aim of bringing together the best in new thinking and new writing at its time from all the countries of Europe that had anything to contribute to the common good, which was an image there of somebody he didn't include within that, but he doesn't really go into that. Eliot noted there may be a function for reviews published in 2 or more languages, such as Adam, and in 2 or more countries simultaneously. But even such reviews must contain some pieces of translation, if they are to be read by everybody. And indeed, in the interwar years, Eliot has sought to do strong links between the Criterion and various other foreign language periodicals, such as the Nouvelle Revue Française, the Neue Rundschau, Revista de Occidente, and Il Convegno. I'm still of the opinion, wrote Eliot in 1946, that the existence of such a network of independent reviews, at least one in every capital of Europe, is necessary for the transmission of ideas. Such a network of magazines, he said, would continually stimulate that circulation of influence of thought and sensibility between nation and nation in Europe, which fertilises and renovates from abroad the literature of each one of them. So I just think we've started to notice these kinds of thinkings. I mean, there was all different versions of this going on in, ideas about European federalism in the political arena, but in the kind of cultural arena that we're looking at, this moment of thinking, if we translate a lot of languages, this will help rebuild Europe after the war. It seems a particular kind of presence in these magazines. So what I'm trying to do is think through what those translation practices in European periodicals, the main focus of the Specialist Translation Project, what they can tell us about the history of modernism in Britain after 1945. And it is mainly modernism rather than the avant-garde, because we can go into the absence of the avant-garde in British writing, but they tend to talk about it in terms of modernism. There's a couple of references I've got to the avant-garde later. There's been considerable work done on Anglophone late and mid-century modernism over the last probably 20 years. Tyrus Miller, Thomas Davis, Jed Esty, James Gifford, a whole series of people. But there's not really a clear consensus has emerged on what are the main kind of features of this. Marina Mackay and Lindsay Stonebridge say that it's a critically awkward period for literary history, for British literary history. But I think perhaps everyone would agree, in the words of Thomas Davis, that one key issue is what Davis calls the transformation and persistence of modernism after 1945. Such work often views the 40s and 50s as the revival of certain tendencies from the pre-war period. For example, the imbrication of aesthetics and politics. You get quite a lot of discussion in magazines like New Road and others of anarchism as a big kind of moment. Or the continuing impact of surrealism. New Road has an issue where you've got a big surrealist section. So such approaches seem marked by a form of working through, to invoke Freud, motifs, questions, issues from modernism pre-1939 are still being interrogated, resisted, and overcome in this later period, albeit with many different nuances and changed historical circumstances. So what I want to do is sketch out some of the forms that this transformation and persistence of modernism takes when we focus on British magazines in the corpus and consider the role of translations. And again, this is kind of different from a lot of the work of the people that have are listed, like Tyrus, Leo Mellon, Marie Mackay, who tend to write about, mostly about novels, a little bit about poetry as well. But magazines have not been really talked about by people talking about mid-century modernism or late modernism. So what I'm going to do is introduce kind of three general tendencies that I've identified in the work. And the first one has a title which is called Beyond British Shores. First then, for Marnow, Eliot and others, there is a commitment to look beyond British shores, to engage deeply with literatures from other countries, particularly Europe, as a bridge building exercise after the slaughter report. We see this in the magazine Adam, this one we have. Because the editor of Adam was a guy called Miron Grindia. Grindia was from Bucharest, and again arrived as a refugee from the Nazis in London in 1939. Grindia was Jewish, Marnow's wife was Jewish. So translation and multilingualism were thus traits that these cosmopolitan outsiders brought to the mainly monolingual world of British magazines. And furthermore, in magazines like Adam, The Gate, Das Tor, English and German bilingual, Two Cities, French-English bilingual, we explicitly see, I think, bilingualism being positioned as a tool to heal, again, post-war division, especially across the landscape of ravaged Europe. So in the first issue of The Gate, Gilbert Murray argued that if civilization is to recover, if Europe is ever again the world centre of humane art and thought, we must shake ourselves free from the passions and prejudices and religious resentments of war. If the material world is in ruins, there is a world of mind, a world of music, art, letters and philosophy, which has never been the property of one nation alone, but is the right meeting place for men of thought and goodwill, irrespective of nationality. So again, that motif of a kind of transnational sharing culture. So in such statements we see magazines as meeting places, developing what, in his mind, I meant to ask you, Sasha, how to pronounce these Dutch names, Margret Brosma and Lies Winter. That's very mangled.
Well, it definitely doesn't sound Dutch.
No, it doesn't, does it?
I wouldn't even know.
They have an article, they are both Dutch, and in the Journal of European Periodical Studies, and they have an idea of the European space of periodicals, which we used. And they talk about how periodicals function as transnational platforms where ideas of Europe were reconstructed after the trauma of war. So in this European space of periodicals, forms of modernism and the avant-garde continue to be a strong presence, I think, in British magazines. As I said, surrealism in Negro or Arena. Or to take another one from my corpus, the magazine Nimbus, which included another Jewish refugee, Ivo Yarossi, as Steve stated, it goes without saying that we shall pay special attention to new developments in the cultural field, both in this country and abroad, and we shall try to combat any tendency to parochialism by publishing translations of new writing abroad and newsletters from contributors in other countries. So in its 13 issues, Nimbus had around 34 translations, about 3 per issue, including work by Jean Cocteau, Pratt, Neruda, Carl Jung, writing here on Picasso. He also has an essay on Ulysses, actually. Or, just to go through this kind of tendency in the magazines we looked at, the magazine Mandrake, which over its lifetime published some 59 translations, that's over 5 per issue, with one highlight being its 7th issue from 1951 on the right, which is devoted to Italian art and culture, including translations from Moravia, Ungaretti and Montani. And so it's quite early. Talking to an Italian colleague, he says, well, you know, it's a bit later you get what the Italians call a boom in the translation of Italian literature, so this is very early. And, one of the things that I found interesting about this magazine was this claim in the editorial to this issue, where it said, linguistically, the barriers are down between ourselves, France, Germany, Italy and Spain, and the time has been reached when a free interchange of ideas should be possible. So again, kind of utopian claim, I think. Mandrake was a very self-consciously little magazine. It was started by a guy called John Wayne, that's W-A-I-N, an Oxford undergraduate in 1945, so it was an undergraduate little magazine. He later became a poet and a novelist and critic. 11 issues of the magazine appeared irregularly over the next decade or so. And Wayne was soon joined as an editor of the magazine by some called Arthur Boyers, who were quite interested and became involved in the publishers Calder and Boyers later on, publishing experimental stuff. From its undergraduate beginnings, the magazine developed. By issue 4, it contained translations of Russian poetry, a translation of poem by Lorca, an article on Cubism. Issue 5, this one here, contained an early translation by Michael Hamburger, who is a translator that crops up across our corpus, one of the key figures in translation, I think, of Lens by the 19th century German writer Georg Bruckner. It also employed a section often used by interwar periodicals called a review of reviews, which is a feature where magazines would say, well, what else is being talked about in other magazines. Short accounts of these. So Mandrake discussed new European magazines such as Sartre's Le Temps Moderne, Mercure, La Table Ronde and Critique, demonstrating again that it was prepared to look beyond British shores. Combating British parochialism was also evident in John Layman's The London magazine, which started in 1954. In his various guises as a magazine editor and a publisher, Layman, the Eton-educated Englishman, was fiercely committed to bringing non-Anglophone literature to his readers. His internationalism stemmed from his experiences in the 1930s, and again indicates that working through a pre-war tendency. Layman was employed by the Wolfs at the Hogarth Press, and was later involved in publishing a number of European writers in translation, but also non-European writers. So the Indian writers Mulkaraj Anand and Ahmed Ali were published at the Hogarth Press, partly when Layman was there. He also, of course, founded a magazine called New Writing, which is a big magazine from the 1930s, 1936, which again he claimed was to introduce foreign writers who had excited my interest during my travels to an English audience. And again, lots of translations in New Writing. So when in 1953, Layman was invited by the newspaper tycoon Cecil Harmsworth King to edit a new literary magazine, he insisted upon the same outward vision for the venture. I intended above all to avoid being narrowly British, he said. There must be writers from the rest of Europe amongst the contributors, above all writers little known in our country. So to this end, Layman travelled to Paris in search of contributors. He met Marguerite Duras, as well as figures in the publishing houses of Plon and Gallimard, trying to get contributions. When the first issue appeared in 1954, Layman's editorial promised an open-door policy to represent the best creative and critical work, both young and old, in Britain. The magazine would be mindful, however, of the fact that without some sense of its European perspective, English literature and thought have always in the past tended to be sorely impoverished, and that today and in the future the world perspective is necessary beyond the European. So we see start kind of an awareness that it's not just Europe that we could translate stuff from. The world perspective is also emphasised in a welcoming message from, surprise, surprise, of course, T.S. Eliot, by then the elder statesman of British modernism and London publishing. I mean, he was the key figure of the Faber publishers, of course, most of the time. Recalling those earlier essays on European unity, in his message in the first issue, Eliot again recalled the criterion and lamented the fact that since the end of the war, there are no serious literary magazines that appeared in London. He said, well, there are half a dozen on the continent for which we have no equivalent. Discussing the function of a literary magazine, Eliot said it must be, in the best sense, international. The magazine must be aware of what is happening in other countries and of what is being written in other languages. So it is somewhat disappointing when you look at this, the contents of the first issue, to see that there is only one piece that comes from beyond the Anglophone world by the French writer Pierre Gascard here. There is a review of Camus' work, translated into The Rebel, by Voltaire. But it kind of gets better. So when we look at the data for across the 11 years of the magazine, we've got 235 translations, about 1.5 an issue, which is kind of respectable for an Anglophone magazine of this type. 21 different language areas, French, Italian and Dutch, German and Greek, 20%. There are some non-European languages there, from the Egyptian, Turkish, Yoruba. And amongst the European writers in translation, you find in the magazine Duras from the meeting, Rob Guillet, writing the Nouveau Roman, Ionescu, Duramas, Calvino. One of the things that you do find in the book review section, that they do review quite a lot of stuff in translation, and that's kind of an interesting aspect that we've thought about in the project and not really been able to quite get to grips with how to deal with it in some ways, which is the reviews of foreign works. And they did so many in the London magazine that the assistant editor commented in a review in 1954 when he was doing a review of 3 minor French novels, and he said, none of these books makes irresistible reading. None of them can be considered a vital contribution to literature. I think that's probably fair of these, but it's a strange story. One wonders, in fact, why they were considered worthy of translation. Is it dearth of native authors that drives publishers to all the trouble and expense involved? Or is it kind of snob fashion grown up, so that no list can be considered distinguished without its quota of foreign names? More charitable to attribute the flood of translations of foreign novels to an abundance of well-qualified translators. And that's a really interesting one. Again, we've tried to kind of look into this without much success. And a growing awareness of the need to strengthen cultural ententes. So, a kind of backhanded compliment to them. But another new magazine where translation was central, and more than merely a case of cultural entente, was magazine 9. And here we see the persistence of a form of modernism very strongly, because what we get in 9 is the influence of Ezra Pound. And of course, Pound in the early 20th century had emphasised the practice of interpretive translation for writers as a kind of practice to be encouraged. 9 was founded by a guy called Peter Russell, who was one of the most committed of Pound's post-war followers. He started an Ezra Pound circle that met in a London pub to discuss Pound. Nothing worse. As well as the Pound Press, where he published English translations of the poet's wartime pamphlets. And also that's kind of, some of that stuff really shouldn't have been translated. But anyway, in the 11 issues of 9, they published some 86 works in translation, a fairly high percentage for a British magazine. They're translated really widely, from Mao Zedong to Lorca, translators including Bernard Bergonzi to Basil Bunting. But what they concentrated on was verse translation. However, some readers clearly believed there was too much and they wanted more like kind of writing by British authors that they'd written in, and the editors defended their approach in an editorial from 1950, where they said rather than printing only original English poetry, a positive and critical attitude towards translation, or a lack of one, is a sure sign of the state of poetry at the period. And again, that's kind of an echo of what Pang would think. But the editorial also reveals that the commitment to translation in 9 was somewhat selective. The taste for contemporary translation, they say, is served well by other magazines. So 9 is going to distinguish between what is truly contemporary and what is superficially so. Drawing upon, at this point, Eliot's arguments about tradition and European identity, they argue that amid the babel of contemporary literature, it's necessary to pick out and reassert the elements which emphasise the wholeness of European poetry. We therefore print translations not only to introduce unfamiliar work, but to throw fresh light upon our own literature, to reveal an affinity or a depth. Hence, what you get in 9 are translations increasingly of past classical authors, Dante, Horace, Villon, Sappho, Petrarch. They start to dominate. And you get an advert in the magazine talking about what their future policy of the magazine will be. And they're going to publish material that will help contemporary literature re-establish creative contact with the past. And they planned issues devoted to Renaissance literature, 2,000 years of Latin, 3,000 years of Greek, and medieval literature. So, in essence, I think you could say what we've got here is a different kind of focus of translation. In translation, it tends to peer backwards, rather than cover new voices in European writing, which you get with something like Mandrake or some of the others. And I think the temporality of what gets translated is a really interesting issue and quite revealing in some ways. If we go back to that issue of New Road that I started with, amongst the Russian writers that they translated were a number of 19th century writers by texts by Dostoevsky, Lermontov, Pushkin. In this issue, again, just to think about temporality of translation and the historicity of what they're involved in, you get a lino cut, a recent lino cut by Picasso, 1955. That's signaling the commitment to what is current with modernism. But also you get a translation of Apollinaire's famous poem Zone, with its rejection of the ancient world and the embrace of urban modernity. Strikingly original, we might say, when it was first published in 1913, Zone might be read more ambivalently in 1945. Was it a prompt to revive the cutting edge of European modernism? Or was it a nostalgic look backwards to an avant-garde prior to the impact of 2 world wars? And I've been trying to think about this and what form of nostalgia this kind of gesture has when you translate something from the past to, and whether it's, if you know that book by Svetlana Boym, where she distinguishes between a nostalgia which is just a simple restorative project, just like, oh, the thing is made in the past, let's recreate it, and what she calls a reflective nostalgia, where you accept that things have changed and you look through what she calls the patina of history, a much more kind of approach to nostalgia informed by Walter Benjamin, for example. And so I'm wondering what this moment of Zone in 1945 represents. But there's a quite strong contrast when I started thinking about the other magazines in our corpus in the other languages, particularly French post-war literary magazines. I think it's quite striking. So one of the magazines in our corpus, Les Lettres Nouvelles, in its first year published translations of recent work by contemporary writers, the Welshman Dylan Thomas in issue 1 here, the German Heinrich Bull, and the American Richard Wright. Richard Wright was extensively translated in Sartre's Le Temps Moderne in the 1940s. Samuel Beckett was published in French as early as 1946, again in Le Temps Moderne. Lettres Nouvelles would publish translations of 2 full translations of Beckett's plays. One was Embers, and this one, Le Dernier Bond, the Crap's Last Tape in English. A translation from Malloy, Beckett's Malloy, was also published in the German magazine Merkur in 1954. And a bit more about Beckett just below. So that's kind of one thing about the historicity of translational temporality. Second kind of tendency then is a section I've called foreign poetry. No. I'll explain that. At least 9 valued translation as such, even if, like Pound himself, theirs was a modernism making it new by looking to the past. The second tendency I would point to, which I think is felt more within kind of just British literature more generally, involves the turning away from foreign literature by those in Britain. That impulse went hand in hand with the view of modernism as a somewhat foreign importation to Britain. The pages of the London magazine covered a whole range of writers, and in 1956 they published this issue called Young English Poets of 1956. Several were poets, Kingsley Amis, Phyllis Larkin, John Betjeman, poets of that thing called the movement, if you know this, which was a movement within English poetry, prosaically named the movement, which really did set itself against, you know, all this foreign stuff. A couple of critics, Keith Tumer and Nate Dorwin, neatly identified the movement as part of a tradition of Englishness in poetry over and against cosmopolitan modernism, which was identified as non-native. These two critics say they exhibit a defensive insularity and a nostalgia for a national culture prior to a perceived decline. So that would be the Svetlana Boyan's restorative nostalgia. One aspect of this was encapsulated when Larkin was asked in an interview in the London magazine whether he read many foreign authors, to which he replied, "Foreign poetry? No." So that's the kind of rejection of it. Now, the wider political relationship between Britain and Europe at this point, I think, also has a significant impact upon the shape of a mid-century modernism, and also partly explains Larkin's dismissal of foreign poetry. Tony Judd, in his great history of post-war Europe, says that since 1945, Britain became, in his words, peripheral to European intellectual life, and instead witnessed the beginnings of a decades-long anxiety about national decline, and the word itself was bandied about quite a lot. Judd himself quotes from T.S. Eliot's Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, where he wrote, "We can assert with some confidence that our own period is one of decline, that the standards of culture are lower than they were 50 years ago, and the evidences of this decline are visible in every department of human activity." Britain's post-war loss of empire, the Suez crisis of 1956, only added to this tone of national decline, while the push towards European integration, founding of the EEC, at that point in the Treaty of Rome, indicated that, you know, Britain's European neighbours seemed to be recovering from the war in ways the British did not envisage. For the movement poets then, Larkin, Betjeman and so on, an interest in modernism seems another symptom of this experience of national decline. Another instance of the British distance from Europe appears in a story concerning the magazine Encounter. And I've not really been able to talk about Encounter that much, but I'm happy to talk about it later. This was the major magazine in English sponsored by the Committee for Cultural Freedom, the later found out to be sponsored and funded by the CIA. And in 1954, Irving Kristol, who was American, was a co-editor with Stephen Spender, turned down an article on the theme of European integration. Kristol gave a revealing explanation for the rejection, writing to Denis Delusional. He said the basic problem is that the article was written by a European, for Europeans, on a European problem. Unhappily, our audience is overwhelmingly not European. The British, when they speak of Europe, do not say we, but they. Now, I think this is kind of quite an interesting one, because it is that kind of rejection of European influences, and modernism is lumped in with it for some people. And I think, to return to the case of Samuel Beckett, I think this is quite illuminating. revealing British attitudes towards the they of Europe, because the Irish Beckett, the Irishman Beckett is now, of course, canonised as part of English literature, but partly due to his post-war decision to write in French, was scandalously neglected by British magazines and British culture generally, and scorned by leading cultural figures, exemplifying the defensive insularity of the movement. For example, that first issue of the Lettre Nouvelle that I showed you the cover for contained a glowing report by Adrien Monnier on Beckett's En Entendant Godot, which had just been performed in Paris. So he had a magnificent reception in the press in Paris. But when Godot was first performed in London 2 years later, the response was far from magnifique. The headline in the Daily Mail, just see the quotes here on Beckett's Went to Godot, said, "The left hand can keep it." And if you know the British press, the Daily Mail is a low bar for cultural opinions, but I like the quote. Sunset Morn, important novelist at that point, said it was two old men picking their toenails. The actor John Gielgud loathed it. And Terence Rattigan, who was one of the kind of key figures in British theatre at the time, said, "All Mr. Beckett has done is to produce one of those things that 30 years ago we used to call experimental theatre, a movement which led absolutely nowhere." So again, that kind of, experiment, modernism, Europe, no thank you, that gesture. And I think it's kind of interesting when I started thinking about Beckett, I noticed he was in the Lettre Nouvelle, and I was thinking, well, where is he in these British magazines? And he just really isn't there. There's nothing on him in Encounter until 1967. The London magazine does at least have an article slightly earlier, quite an interesting article by Christine Brooks Rose in 1958, looking at his kind of technique. And it's only in Nimbus in 1953 that we find a short article by Richard Seaver publicising the first publication of Beckett's novel What, by a small group around the expatriate magazine Merlin. And he writes, and it's quite revealing himself, Collection Merlin, a young Paris publishing venture devoted to publishing in English, has just made available the last work Beckett composed in English before turning, in desperation it would seem, of ever interesting an English-speaking audience to French as a literary medium. So arguably Beckett was seen as part of the European avant-garde before being welcomed back into English literature. Part of a tendency in Britain in the 1950s to turn away both from foreign literature and modernism too, and sometimes, as with the movement, these two were conflated. A third feature of mid-century modernism is rather more outward-looking, and that's what I've called the world perspective, picking up Layman's term. And that's the increasing presence, I suppose, in the mid-century of writers from Britain's ex-colonies. Caribbean writers such as George Lamming and Sam Selvon, of course, did not need to be translated as such, but there's an argument that they transformed the language of English literature, or perhaps translated it from the 1950s onwards, and reworked the idioms of modernism. Peter Collini, for example, notes that such writers as Selvon and Lamming represent a culmination, not a repudiation, of interwar modernism. So it's the kind of working through the Collini of earlier forms. In the London magazine, Layman published Sam Selvon's Song of Sixpence in 1960 and reviewed Lamming's In the Castle of My Skin in 1954. And in an editorial from 1955, Layman noted that the novels of Selvon, Lamming and other West Indian writers had, quote, something of the upthrusting vitality and self-discovery that the best working class books of the 30s had. It's a strange compliment, again, it's slightly backhanded in some ways, but at least it's kind of, he's saying there's something going on here that needs to be covered. But again, it's very scantily covered, this work, in British magazines. There is nothing in Encounter by Selvon or Lamming, but they published quite a lot by James Baldwin because they have a very American focus. carefully talked about. But the contrast with other European magazines is interesting. A serialised translation of In the Castle of My Skin appears in both L'État Moderne and Mercure. And of course, from the 1940s onwards, we witnessed the development of cultural infrastructure in the Caribbean, which is separate from that of London. This resulted in little magazines such as BIM in Barbados, which did much to promote Caribbean writing in the period. But there is no British equivalent to the cultural politics exemplified in Présence Africaine, which is one of the magazines in our corpus. Alliance Diop's magazine, then publisher and a bookshop, that was embedded within Paris but devoted to promoting Pan-African culture and had a lot to do with publicising the theory of negritude pioneered by Senghor and Aimé Césaire. And in 1956, Présence Africaine organised this very significant 1956 Congress on Black Writers and Artists, a major event in cultural decolonisation. Perhaps the strongest exemplar of the world perspective in the corpus of British magazines, however, is represented by Miron Grindier's Adam International Review, which is the magazine I mentioned earlier. We can, I think, safely assume that Philip Larkin was not a subscriber to Grindier's Adam, a magazine that, apart from its bilingualism, consistently covered the arts and literatures of other countries. So here's the kind of pie chart, donut, I think they call it, of the languages, the source languages are there. And you can see that's probably larger than any of the other English magazines in our corpus. Spanish largest, then French. Curiously, though, it's bilingual, they would also occasionally translate stuff from French into English, so that's why French is there. But you can see that they're covering an awful lot of languages. And the one that isn't there, which I quite like, and I was pleased when I found it, was the other Swiss language, Romansh. And they have some translations of T.S. Eliot's Preludes in Romansh in this magazine. So, in 1947 alone, special issues appeared in Adam on Italian poetry, Swiss literature, Latin American literature, Catalan literature, followed in the next few years by issues on the literature of Denmark, Ecuador, the Netherlands, Portugal, Japan. In an early indication of the growth of Caribbean literature, there was an issue of Adam in 1946 devoted to West Indian poetry. Translations from two poets from Cuba and one from Haiti, Jacques Orman. The translator, interesting enough, was the Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes. So, unlike the neglect of Beckett that I mentioned earlier, Grindier, after seeing the premiere of Endgame in London in 1957, corresponded with Beckett to obtain, unsuccessfully, some of his unpublished works for Adam. I've not got to the bottom of why he couldn't get the stuff, but that would have been the earliest probably we could find of Beckett in these magazines. One can speculate how far Grindier's status as an outsider in London informed the world perspective of the magazine. Certainly another exile, the Indian writer Mulkraj Anand, identified this aspect of Grindier's work when he spoke to him in the early 1970s. And it was clear, I found this in the archive, but King's College London recently, that Mulkraj Anand, who there's been quite a lot of work done on him recently, Cooley, The Untouchable, and so on. I'd obviously met Grindier in London in the 40s, and he said, I vividly recall the cafe near the British Museum where we used to meet during the war, exiles and refugees, and talk about unpublished writings which were shelved by the paper shortage. You conceived Adam as Iqbal Singh brought out Indian writing, encouraged by the other little magazines which were sprouting. This was around about the same time that Grindier visited Senghor, then the president of Senegal. Looks very Grindier on the right, looking very pleased to get something signed by him. But then this resulted in an issue of Adam in 1973 devoted to the topic of negritude. So again, very early for British magazines to even contemplate, thinking about this material. This cosmopolitan quality to Adam was articulated in Grindy's first editorial in 1946. Yeah, and I thought you would like this, Sasha, because there's an article by Poggioli on biblical. The editorial, he said, Adam will endeavour to promote research in the study of comparative modern literature, furthering the task of an active humanism. And that is another aspect of this post-war moment, attempts to reformulate kinds of humanism to inform what's going on, an active humanism, they called it. So just to move to a kind of conclusion then, discerning the shape of mid-century modernism in Britain is still today, I think, quite a difficult task. And it certainly felt so for people writing at the time. Take, for example, an article by Philip Toynbee. I'll just give you the first bit of the quote from this so you can see the title. From the London magazine. An article in 1956 called Experiments and the Future of the Novel. A kind of weariness pervades this piece, as if everything has already been achieved and experimental fiction has got nowhere to go. He talks about Elizabeth Bowen, he said she's really interesting, but he said, in comparison to Kafka, she's clearly not an experimental novelist. We can debate that one, I guess. But he says the contemporary English novelist is on his own, struggling in a collapsed tradition, uncertain of his intractable medium, and uncertain of his constantly changing material. So this tone of uncertainty is the dominant one. And it's also found in Layman's editorial in the same issue, where he says, it's difficult not to feel the present is a moment of peculiar confusion in literature, with the impulses of 20 or even 10 years ago fading out, and no new impulses of sufficient force and inspiration taking their place. So the shape of any post-war modernism or avant-garde was clearly yet to appear in the British case. In a 1954 editorial, Layman said, for the first time since the 1870s, there is no avant-garde in English writing. This is undoubtedly true, says Layman. There are new writers, but an experimental school or front or movement is certainly not discernible yet. Layman's uncertainty over the existence of a discernible movement or front is only a little less true, I think, for critical opinion today. However, the work of the Spartrome project has convinced me that translation has a significant place in our understanding of post-war British writing. When we try to map the contours of mid-century modernism in Britain, then we need to think not only about stylistic features or formal kind of motifs from early periods, but also what the practice of translation was doing in periodicals and how it signified a sense of being modern. The extensive interest in translation in British magazines then after 1945 can be understood as a working through of the persistence of pre-war forms of modernism. As Eliot, Grindy or Layman all understood, the English language was very far from having had a monopoly on modernism and the avant-garde in the interwar years. To return to New Road's map one final time, one central promise of modernism, broken but still alive at this point, was of a transnational or an international set of practices that ventured freely across national frontiers. The practice of translation lay at the heart of such border crossing. Remember that optimistic editorial from Mandrake, linguistically the barriers are down between ourselves and the free exchange of ideas should be possible. But how far translation impelled the development of new forms of modernism in Britain in the mid-century is still difficult to assess. Leo Meller has noted that using the term modernism for texts after 1945 is a way to, quote, appreciate the fact that varieties of formal experimentation were the complex modes for depicting the political and aesthetic conditions of being modern again. So for him, it's kind of compulsion to repeat that's going on. And I would suggest that we add the term translation to our understanding of how mid-century writing becomes modern again. Translated work signified how being modern was intrinsically linked to forms of internationalism and transnationalism. At best, the translation of foreign authors might have helped propel forward the development of the new British modernism. At worst, it indicated a gap when that modernism did not yet